Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's.
Oh, I can't hear you. That I can see us. Right, I'm going to speakers and see. How's it now?
I can still hear you, Ollie.
I can hear you now. I couldn't hear you
Perfect.
before, so that's why I got a
Brilliant.
bit nervous.
No, that's fine. Right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's second interview to our sixth. No, it's not. It's our 12th interview of British Science Week. Our sixth day of doing these interviews and sharing with you the power of engineering as part of our sport for British Science Week. We've had some fantastic guests over the last 6 days, as well as over the last few months, and we've been delighted to share some incredible stories. And the final one of this year's season is not one to be missed either. So I'm delighted that we're joined by Dr. Ollie Folayan, who is head of process at Plus Aberdeen and also the co-founder of the AFBE, the Association for BNE Engineers. And today he's going to be telling us his story about how he read a book about an evil genius and then became a chemical engineer. So without further ado, Ollie, I'm going to hand over to you and I'll let you take it away. If anybody's got questions as we're going, please use the Q&A function. And at the end, I will start fielding those questions and we'll hopefully get some really interesting answers, I'm sure.
I hope so. I hope so. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I was wondering if because I have a few questions for the guys in the audience. So I'm wondering if I can if I ask them if I will get a few responses.
Unfortunately, because of how we host them, we won't be able to do live responses.
That's
However,
okay.
I'm sure that people will be able to put answers into the chat or into the chat function for us to see.
That's all. That's all I need. That's all I need. That's fantastic. Fantastic. Well, real pleasure to meet everyone. Thank you for having me. And I want to tell you a story today about myself and tell you about how I read a book about an evil genius and decided to become an engineer, and particularly a chemical engineer. So I'm going to tell you a bit about myself. Just take some notes and feel free to ask any questions. Right. So this is me at the age of 10. And it wasn't long before this, I decided that after reading this book about a really powerful guy, I particularly liked the way this powerful guy was able to use chemicals and solar energy to kind of dominate the world. And I remember asking my dad a few questions. My dad was an engineer. And so I asked him, how many chemicals do chemical engineers make? And he said to me, any chemical. And so I thought, that's it. I'm going to be a chemical engineer. And that's really the story of my career. But I was always interested in a lot of the STEM subjects, always interested in mathematics, always interested in the way that things worked. And I remember we used to have these video recorders, and I remember breaking it a few times, just trying to figure out what else you could do with it. And over time, that interest just grew. I was also very interested in fire and the way that things burn. I still find it quite interesting when I look in a flame. And I don't know how many of you have ever looked at a candle burning, a flame burning, and there's just something about it. And those two passions of mine, a love of mathematics, love of, finding out how things worked, and particularly of chemicals, having met an evil genius in a book, and also my love of fire ended up kind of what I decided to study. So I went to the University of Sheffield in 1996 and studied a degree in chemical engineering and fuel technology. And then in the second year of my chemical engineering degree, I learned about the way nitrogen oxides work and the harm that they do to the environment when they're burned in fuels. And that really inspired me. And so when I completed my chemical engineering degree, I went on to do a doctorate in combustion. And that's when you do research and try and work out novel ways of solving some of the problems in the world. I have now worked in various on projects based in pretty much every continent. And whilst I never got to travel to all of these places, I did travel to some places, and I got to make some differences. In addition to that, I also lead a charity, and it's a charity that helps young people of all backgrounds into engineering and to learn about STEM roles. And I co-founded that with my sister, is in the picture here. And here's a picture of my family. I'm a father and a husband, and my daughter is 11. So, first question I wanted to ask you in the chat is, if I gave you £1,000,000, I don't have £1,000,000, but if I gave you £1,000,000 and I asked you not to use it to buy a new house or your new toy or whatever it is that you like to do, and I ask you instead to solve a problem, what would that problem be? So I'm quite curious. If you had £1,000,000 and you could solve any problem, what problem would you solve? I'll wait for 1 or 2 answers in the chat before I move on. Any responses? Oh, I can see. Ocean pollution. Love it. Sophie is very exemplary. I'd like to be like you when I grow up. You're fantastic. Anyone else? One other attempt before I move on. Global warming. That is a big problem. And I'm so impressed that you are looking to solve problems in the world. Well, you're absolutely right. Those are 2 areas that need to be solved. And all over this world, there's so many problems. There are people who don't have food. There are others who are affected by the impact of global warming. There's all kinds of problems in this world. And the United Nations has actually looked into all of these problems, and they've come up with something called the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them. And although there are 17 of them, you can actually put them in these 5 categories. So they're goals that address the issue of poverty and poor health. There are goals that have to do with people getting an education. There are parts where, for example, if you're a girl, you may not be allowed some parts of the world to get an education, which is a shame. There are problems with equality. There are problems with the environment and sustainability, as you said. And then there are loads of people without housing or with who don't have energy to either power their homes or do the things that they need to do. And so these are all those problems in the world. And you have 2 sets of professionals who are preoccupied with how you address these problems. The first ones are scientists, and scientists spend a lot of time trying to understand the world. And, you and I would have a much tougher life if it wasn't for great scientists. Now, you also have these societal needs, as I said, and every time we need to apply our scientific knowledge to solve the problems in the world, an engineer has to get involved. So whatever problems you can think of in this world, whether it's poverty, global warming, and so on, there are a number of very clever people called scientists who try to understand the problem, and there is an engineer somewhere working on it. As somebody said, engineers are custodians of the past and the creators of the future. Or somebody else said, scientists study the world as it is, engineers create the world as it has never been. And my favorite quote for engineers actually came from the late Prince Philip. He says, everything that wasn't invented by God was invented by an engineer. Wow. So engineers have a huge role to play in society. And that brings me to my branch of engineering, which is chemical engineering. Now, how many of you can cook? Is there anyone here who can cook? I'm going to look in the chat to see. How many of you know how to, cook a meal, maybe pasta or something, or potatoes, whatever it is? Anyone? Well, usually I'm sure some of you can. I'm sure there are people out there who can cook.
We've had one school confirm they can cook pasta in the Q&A feed, so we've definitely got somebody out there who can cook.
Yay! Fantastic, fantastic. Now, imagine that you had to cook a meal for maybe your mum and dad. You would have a number of you know, your ingredients, you know, maybe get your pasta, get your salt, get the water, get the pots and all of that. Then if imagine that the following day I come to you and I say, I would really like you to cook for the whole of London, maybe 500,000 people. That's a huge ask. So you will then need to think about all of your instruments. Think about the pots that you need. Think about so much food that you need. Actually, that is what chemical engineers do. So when scientists take their experiments, if I compare the work the scientists do in the lab, I compare it to what to you just making a meal for your family. If you then had to scale that up for a larger number of people, you then have to involve a chemical engineer. So we're involved in taking simple raw materials, taking it through a process and creating materials and products that you and I use every day. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. It's one of the reasons why chemical engineers are often referred to as process engineers, because what we do is we take raw materials through a process and we create some useful products. And the important thing is the processes that we do have to satisfy a number of things. They have to work. So a process has to work. It has to be good for the environment. It has to be safe, and it has to be cost effective for it to work. So it must meet those criteria. So before I move you any further to tell you about chemical engineering, I'd like you to tell me who these people are. Well, let me try. Does anyone know who the man at the left of my slide is? Does anyone know who that is? Anyone? Anyone at all? I'll give you a clue. He's a very important man in a big Asian country.
We've had an answer come in from in the Q&A that says it's China's president.
Yay, very good. Yes, that's President Xi Jinping. Now, because you're all very young, I'm pretty sure you won't know who some of the other people are. So this lady here, her name is Cindy Crawford, and she is a very famous actress. You may know this person. His name is Ashton Kutcher. He's also a very famous actor. He's acted in quite a number of interesting movies. I'm sure you guys know who the next person is. The man in the red tie. You must know. Yay, Sophie's right. Mr. Bean, yes. And his real name is Rowan Atkinson. This one I'm pretty sure you won't know. His name is Dolph Lundgren, and he has acted as a baddie in movies. And then the last person here has acted in Star Trek and done a lot of really amazing things. Her name is Mae Jemison. Now, so we talked about the Chinese president. We talked about a model and actress, scientist and engineer and actress. These five. Now, can anyone tell me who the odd person out is? Who's the odd person out of these five people? Which one is not like the others? You're allowed any guess. Ah, very good, Mr. Bean. Very clever. And I'll tell you why Mr. Bean is different from the others. It's not just because he is, not because he's funnier than the others, but he's actually an electrical engineer. Rowan Atkinson actually went to university and he studied electrical engineering. Everyone else here studied chemical engineering. So that's the difference at university. Both Ashton Kutcher and Cindy Crawford never finished their degrees, but they all enrolled to study chemical engineering. So the big difference, I mentioned chemists and I mentioned chemical engineers. The big difference between a chemist and a chemical engineer has to do with originality and scale. So while chemists are very, very preoccupied with the principles, the processes, and to try to understand things, chemical engineers scale things up. So if there's nothing else you get from today, is to remember that chemical engineers scale things up. Now, these are some of the companies that engineers work in. And, this one's a pharmaceutical company. So if you used any of your medicines, you probably got them from GSK. Many of you will know Shell because your mum and dad probably stop at a station to put fuel in. This is just a solar panel company. It's Procter & Gamble, there's L'Oreal, because you're worth it. I don't know if you've seen that advert. And then there's Intel. Now, can anyone tell me which of these companies does not hire chemical engineers? So I mentioned GlaxoSmithKline, a solar cell company, Shell, Procter & Gamble, L'Oreal, Intel. Which one of these does not hire chemical engineers? Any attempt? Someone said Procter & Gamble.
And I've
interesting.
got there's an attendee who's put it in the chat saying Intel from one school. They're getting Intel.
I thought you might say Intel. Now, that was a trick question, guys. Every one of these guys hire chemical engineers. All of them do. So all the pharmaceuticals generally produce plants where they carry out reactions at large scale, and they produce medicines that you and I use. Shell has lots of refineries and they provide petrol for our cars. Procter & Gamble produce a lot of fiber and a lot of materials, and they have to use chemical engineers to do that. Same with L'Oreal. What about Intel? So Intel, every one of our computers has something called a semiconductor. So conductors generally transmit electricity. Non-conductors don't transmit electricity. Semiconductors have to be heated, and then they become a conductor. And the board that is used for these is also produced by chemical engineers. So all of these companies actually hire chemical engineers. Now, here's a number of other things, sort of weird things that chemical engineers do. So you've got cosmetics here, and generally for these to be produced in a way that helps in a way that's good for the skin and does not harm your skin when people put on makeup. That's made by chemical engineers. In 2020, we were all running to Tesco to buy loads of loo roll because we were running out. And again, those fibers and dyes are generally made by chemical engineers. Even ice cream, because generally, in order to do things at a very large scale, you need some chemical engineers who look at the texture, who carry out all kinds of equations just to ensure that we get it right. And that is all made by chemical engineers. So next time you go to the loo or you go to buy some ice cream, think about a chemical engineer because they're involved in the process. Now, what do we do? Some of the things that we do involve things like separation processes. So you might have some gas that gets taken out of the ground before it makes its way to your house. We have to remove some impurities from it. So we have to remove, for example, some sulfur compounds, which are really bad for the environment and bad for your consumption. And we do that with something called an amine sweetening plant. As you will see here, what you have is you've got the gas comes in, goes into something called an absorber. We have something like a reagent which flows through and comes in contact with the gas, takes out the impurities. It's like a detective. It finds the impurities, takes them out of the gas. The gas goes to the national grid, and it gets used in your houses. So chemical engineers are involved in that. What about refineries? Most of our cars still run on petrol or diesel, and that generally comes from crude oil. It's put in something called a fractional distillation that looks at the boiling point of a mix and separates them into various fuels that we use in cars, we use in our houses, and planes fly on, and so on, as you can see here. So there's loads of things that chemical engineers are involved in. Now, more recently, we have been involved with something called the energy transition. And what the energy transition is the process by which we are going to make the production of energy cleaner. So it's called a transition because we have to think about the complex ways in which we generate renewable sources at large scale. But in the meantime, before we get to a point where we can fully rely on renewable sources, we've got to make sure that the consequences of any fuel we're burning are mitigated or taken care of. And so that whole process is called the energy transition. Now, what does the energy transition look like? I would put that in two different categories. You can have digital solutions and you can have non-digital solutions. And I'll give you an example of a digital solution. So every time the crude oil is produced, somebody has to get onto a helicopter. They have to fly onto an offshore platform where they get all of the oil and gas, and they have to operate. And sometimes even the process of flying loads of people out offshore burns a lot of fuel, and that's not good for the environment, right? And so the industry has been thinking about different ways of preventing or reducing the number of flights that need to be taken offshore. So in 2014, I was working on a plant and I was the main chemical engineer on that job. And it was an offshore plant in order to put lots of high pressure gas into a gas well. But I didn't have to go offshore. I was in something called a smart room, and I was able to do all of my engineering work from there. So I didn't need to fly, and more of these are being used. And that's at a certain level, that's one of the ways in which the industry is thinking of running things more efficiently. But there are even better ways, because while I was here onshore, I was talking to other human operators offshore, and they obviously had to fly offshore. And so one of the other ways to avoid that is to have something called, an automated operator. So I'd like you to meet Spot. Now, what I'm going to do quickly is unshare because I didn't click on the sound button. So I'm just going to do that quickly and then come back. So bear with me just 1 second. Oh, actually, did I need to do that for this one? Let's see. Right. Yes, I do need to do that. So I will just share, and you can tell me if you can hear the sound. Can you hear it?
We can, yes.
Oh, apologies for that. Just trying to get rid of this.
Several hours a day, several operators will walk the facility, read gauges, listen for noise that doesn't sound right, look out at the horizon for anomalies, boats that may not be caught on radar, look for sheens, and so on and so on. So primarily right now, what we're looking to do with Spot, or what we're doing with Spot, is really trying to replicate that observation piece, so that I don't need necessarily an operator to go do that. I can have an operator actually review that information from a central location, if you will.
Fantastic. So I'm gonna move on to that. So that's a good example. Now I've got a few questions for you. How much CO2 is there in the atmosphere? How much CO2 is there in the atmosphere? Anyone got an answer? Oh, somebody said 1.3 billion. Now, it is 0.04%. So that's about 400 parts per million. So whilst that might sound like a small amount, that's actually quite a lot of CO2. And we know that CO2 is bad for the environment because it causes global warming. And one of the tasks that we do as chemical engineers is get rid of the CO2 in the environment. So sometimes the CO2 comes because you burn fossil fuels and you produce CO2, but there is CO2 in the environment anyway. And chemical engineers are now coming up with ways of ensuring that you can reduce the CO2 that's in the environment. And but it's not just engineers that are doing that. Scientists have also come up with a number of ways. Now, one of those ways is revealed in the clue to this question. How many trees are there on the Sahara Desert? How many trees are there in the Sahara Desert? So that's a question for you. Anybody got an answer? Someone says 0. Okay, I'll wait for one more attempt before I move on. 100. Oh, wow. Wow. Now, what I'm going to tell you is going to surprise you. There are 1.8 billion trees on the Sahara. And we only found that out in 2020 because there were some engineers at the National Aerospace, the National Space Agency, NASA in America. And they were able to use artificial intelligence to actually count the number of trees in the Sahara. So I was very surprised to find out that there are 1.8 billion trees on the Sahara. Yet it is such a huge space that one of the ways in which scientists have considered that you could actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere is through planting trees and planting even more trees, turning the Sahara green. I was surprised to find out that there are actually more. There are also ways of genetically modifying algae to ensure that you can actually take in a lot more CO2. But the problem with all of these is that engineered solutions are about 500 times more efficient than any of these methods. And that is why chemical engineers are such an important part. So you can see what we actually try to do in this picture here. So here what you've got is you have a factory. They carry out their usual activity. We have ways of removing the CO2 that is produced by those plants. And once they're produced, we can store them. We can either store them in some underground cave system, or you can store them under the ocean, because the ocean is actually one of the biggest sinks. Of course, you have to be careful with storing too much CO2 in the ocean, because then that could be dangerous for aquatic life. But then once the CO2 is captured, it can then be reused, and it can be reused in your bottles. For example, if you buy a Tango or a Coke, there's some CO2 in there. It's used in concrete, it's used in plastics, and in so many other ways. So those are some of the things that we do. And the way that we do it is we've come up with different ways of capturing carbon. So one method that I'm working on at the moment, a project I'm working on at the moment, is something called dry air capture. And what you have is you have a number of cooling towers, and you have a chemical reagent. These fans have a way of pulling air into this cooling tower. And in the cooling tower, the air comes in contact with a chemical reagent. And that chemical reagent removes the CO2 from the process. So it removes the CO2 from the air, and that CO2 then gets stored, and the CO2 is then used. So that's one of the things that we do. The other thing that we're doing for the environment is thinking of other fuels apart from fossil fuels. So one of the most effective ones is hydrogen. And there are different ways of producing hydrogen, and there are different types of hydrogen. And the greener, or the less dependent on fossil fuels your way of producing hydrogen is, the greener it is. So there are all kinds of methods. We can take methane and we can break that, and we can use that to produce hydrogen. And that's often referred to as gray hydrogen. or you can produce something called syngas, which is a combination of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And you can take out the hydrogen and that can be used, or you can use electrolysis to produce entirely green hydrogen. And these are ways in which we are working. In addition to hydrogen, we also have something called biofuels. So there's something called renewable diesel, where the fuels are taken from plants rather than the usual fossil fuels. And those produce a cleaner fuel that is even used on planes and so on. So in Singapore, there is a refinery, which is the largest renewables refinery in the world. And it's owned by a Finnish company called Neste, and they produce renewable diesel. So I'm just going to show you some things about that now.
For Finnish energy giant Neste, it is making a big bet here in the western end of Singapore. Neste is already the world's largest producer of renewable diesel. Now it wants to fuel growth by pumping $1.5 billion in a new refinery here in Singapore, with a capacity to double production by 2022. Effectively raising the stakes here to 2.6 million tons. So what exactly goes into generating renewable diesel? Breaking down the facts for us is Site Director Kenneth Lim.
We have more than 10 different kinds of feedstocks. So this, as you can see, is the animal's fat, one of the feedstock that we use. And we also have, for example, used cooking oil, soybean oil, as well as even fish oil, fish fats.
Where exactly do you source the feedstock from?
In the region, we source in Australia and right now even sourcing from China and North America. So we have a global feedstock base.
I was given a tour around the high security facility.
Behind here, this is the pre-treatment facility process, which means it purifying the feedstocks. All of the feedstocks we collected, all of the feedstocks are loaded on the pot. Behind it is actually the pot already, so everything is unloaded there and then moved to this facility, to this process.
After pre-treatment, the raw materials go to the refinery.
This is the next BTL process, which means it converts the purified feedstocks into the renewable diesel, and it is the patent technology of Neste.
So from here, it goes out into the market?
Yes, before it's shipped to the customers, we will do the test of the end product to make sure it meets all of the requirements from our customers.
The expanded plant will boost Neste's total renewables production to 4.5 million tons annually. And it comes out really clean and transparent?
It is. This is what it is coming out from the plant. So unlike the fossil diesel, renewable diesel does not contain aromatics, so it's very clean. We can reduce up to 90% of our carbon emissions compared to traditional fossil diesel. It burns very clean. It performs much better than the fossil diesel because it has a high cetane number.
CEO Peter Varnaker expects demand for renewable diesel to quadruple by 2030.
So I'm gonna stop there and just So generally, I hope I've given you an idea of what chemical engineers do. We're involved in absolutely everything that you have to use on a daily basis. Everything from driving your car to, as we talked about, ice cream or even going to the loo, chemical engineers are involved. But we're also involved in some of the cutting edge technology for the future to ensure that we have a more sustainable planet. So I hope I've given you a good idea, and I welcome any questions from you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. Honestly, I've learned a lot. So I know that the schools who are with us today will have learned a lot as well. So the opportunity is now open, as Ollie said, then for you to start asking questions. So we've already had the first question that's come in from Julia. So we'll begin with hers, and anybody else who would like to ask, please just pop them into the Q&A or into the chat function, and we will get through them in the next 10 minutes or so. So the Julia's question is, how did you become an engineer?
So what I had to do was, first of all, I was always very interested in the STEM subjects. So particularly mathematics. I was interested in the way that things worked. And I also had people around me who inspired me. So my father's an engineer, my younger sister's an engineer, and my dad used to say that he, in his big because he was brought up in a big African family, and in those cultures they used to have some really big homes, and he often says that he was number 23 in the list of engineers in the family. So I had that sort of environment around me of people who were in that field, and I was always very interested in how things worked. And so I did my usual sort of STEM subjects, particularly mathematics, physics, and chemistry. And really, it was doing those subjects that then went on to do that got me the opportunity to study chemical engineering at the University of Sheffield. While I was there, I did spend some time doing a job at another department, Imperial College, and I met a few people there who were doing their PhDs, and I started to speak to them about alternative fuels, and they got me interested in it. And so from that point, I decided once I finished my degree, I'm going to do a PhD. And then after doing that, I then went into work. And my first job was a company that builds boilers, not the kind of boilers you use in your house, but the kind of boilers they use to generate power in our homes and factories and so on. And they did that all over the world. And I was involved in those. And then beyond that, I started to work in refineries and offshore plants. And now I'm working on quite a lot of projects that are about renewable energy.
Brilliant. And the next question is, did you always want to be a chemical engineer?
I suppose from the age of 9, after reading about the evil genius, yes. Before that, I did consider other jobs. I quite liked what firemen did. I thought this is quite, it's quite fascinating. They go into a situation and they rescue people. But the thing is, as an engineer, as a chemical engineer, I'm involved in saving people's lives. In fact, there's often a saying that engineers save more lives than doctors. And the reason we say that is because if you go into a hospital and you look at everything that they work on, it was made by an engineer. And very often in the process of preventing illness, you need good water, you need energy, you need access to good medication, and all of those are made by engineers. And so in that sense, although I never got to be a fireman, I feel like I'm doing just like they're doing. We're saving lives as well. So
brilliant. Don't forget, if you want to ask questions, please pop them into the Q&A or into the chat function. The next one that we've got is, what's your favorite thing about being an engineer?
I'll tell you what my favorite thing is. It's taking a concept, an idea, building on that idea, and seeing it come to life. And what happens is that sometimes you have a problem, say a problem on the plant. You're working on a plant, and there is a problem that they either need to be able to produce more, or they need to make it safer for people to operate in. So I, as an engineer, will sit with, I'll think of a few solutions to the problem. I will work with a team, and then we'll build it into what we call the front-end engineering design, so an early stage. And at that early stage, our main purpose is to say, if we are actually to do this, can we afford it? And so once we've decided that this is affordable and this is necessary, we'll do something called a detailed design. When you eventually get to the point of actually building and making it work, you almost always run into some problems. You run into problems, not because what you did was wrong, but because the reality of, it could be the weather, there are things that you'll never be able to control. And that's where I find the most interesting thing about being an engineer, because what you then have to do is think through, how do we solve this problem? And you surround yourself with a team of other engineers. So I have to work with a safety engineer, with an instruments engineer, with a mechanical engineer, and we all sit and we all think through the problem and we come up with a solution, and then it works. It's the best feeling in the world.
Brilliant. And that just sounds incredible. The next question is around inventing, and it's very simple. Do you like inventing things?
I do actually, and still what I want to do. So when I was a young boy and I was thinking about all those fields, actually I was thinking, is there a way to invent a new way of burning things that wouldn't be so bad for the environment? So that yeah. So I do like understanding how things work, making things, and the best part actually is when you get to put your own imprint on what's happening, when you get to put your own ideas on it. I enjoy that. When I did my PhD, for example, I came up with a way of reducing nitrogen oxides from the environment that doesn't involve the use of catalysts, but still gives you a high percentage of reduction of nitrogen oxides. Because for most of us, your car has underneath it has something called a catalytic converter. And what that does is that it takes all the nitrogen oxides from the atmosphere and it reduces them so that it's, because nitrogen oxides are generally bad for us to inhale and they're bad for the environment. But the catalyst can be quite expensive. And so what I was trying to do and what we managed to do at a commercial scale was actually find a non-catalytic way. And actually, I wanted to keep doing more of that. So yes, I do like making things.
And the next question that we've got in is around your job. And do you find that your job is full of unexpected challenges?
Absolutely. In fact, that would have been the other best thing about the job, is that you never really feel like you know it all. You feel like you're always learning, as in literally every day. So yesterday, I was looking at something, an electrodialysis cell, and looking at the way that works. And what that does is when CO2 is removed from the air, it goes into a system that separates the parts that you want by their charges. So all of the positives go, towards the negative and vice versa, and you get your CO2 removed at the end that you can store. I'm constantly, all through the 20 years, I've been an engineer now for almost 20 years, and every time you find that you never feel like, oh, I've got this now. You're always learning something new.
Brilliant. And the next question is about your favorite project. What's been the favorite thing that you've worked on so far?
I would say that one of the most interesting, and maybe put it that way, one of the most interesting ones I worked on actually fairly recently is a plastics to hydrogen project. And what that does is we take waste plastics, and I don't know, you would have seen some of the shows that show all of the plastics that are in the ocean and in different places. And we take these waste plastics. You actually get paid to collect them because we're trying to get rid of these. They're a real problem. And you shred them into very small pieces. And then you feed them into something called a kiln, a rotary kiln, and inject some steam into it. And that's called a gasification process. And what that process gives you at the end is what we call syngas. Syngas is a combination of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And from that, we're able to remove the hydrogen, we can pressurize the hydrogen, and we can send it to different users, and it's a much cleaner fuel. And it's still in the very early stages, but it's a very interesting project that I've worked on.
Brilliant. And the next question we've got is around in your presentation, you were speaking about the number of trees in the Sahara Desert. And the next question says that, do you think planting trees in the Sahara Desert will help global warming?
It will, but as I pointed out, and I was doing that specifically, I deliberately showed you that picture. And first of all, I was surprised to find that there were so many trees actually on the Sahara. And so I like sharing that with people, because everyone's always surprised when they find out. And yes, we need to do that. We need to plant more trees in order to remove CO2. But the problem with that is, in terms of its effectiveness, how much CO2 you're actually able to get out, you can get far more efficiency with engineered solutions than you can with natural solutions. So whilst we should be doing everything, we should be planting trees, we should be looking at different ways, we should look, there's something else called enhanced weathering, And that's where you've got something like a quarry, and that quarry is able to take basically take CO2 out of the atmosphere and convert them into carbonates, and those carbonates can basically sit in the soil, if you like. We ought to be thinking about all the different ways of doing that. But the important thing is, if you're ever going to do it at a scale that is fast enough and good enough for us to meet the targets of the 1.5 to 2 from pre-industrial levels, which is what the IPCC's target, if we're going to do that, we must have engineered solutions, because those are a lot more efficient.
Perfect. So this is, I love it when we ask this question. If you weren't an engineer, what would you be?
Whew, that's a really interesting one. So there are a lot of other things that I enjoy doing. I've been a singer in a gospel choir, and I actually, it's funny because I ran into an old colleague some years ago who I hadn't seen for a long time, and the first thing he asked me was nothing to do with, he was another chemical engineer, but he didn't ask me anything about chemical engineering. He says, "Do you still sing?" Because that was a huge part of my life. I don't sing quite as much, so maybe if I wasn't an engineer, maybe, who knows, maybe I'd try to be a pop star or something. Go on the X Factor.
Brilliant. I love that. No, that's fantastic. And for pupils in school today, what subjects do they need to be paying attention to if they want to go into engineering?
I will say two things. So there are some people that are very academic, and others who are not necessarily. But the subjects that you need to think about is mathematics. You need to think about mathematics, think about physics and chemistry. Those are the main ones. Now, there are other branches of chemical engineering that I didn't cover today. And one of the big areas of chemical engineering is biotechnology. And so one of the things that you may want to consider is biology as well. And that was the subject I really enjoyed in school. But yeah, those are some of the subjects to consider. If you have any problem, if you struggle with those subjects, I would say, find the ones that you're really interested in, and the ones that you are struggling with, get somebody who can give you some tutoring outside of school. And there are so many STEM programs these days that you can attend and just help you in those particular areas. But there's another way to be an engineer, which is also a very important way, and we don't talk about nearly enough, and that's through an apprenticeship. So some people, instead of going to the usual traditional going to university, actually they go on an apprenticeship. And I spoke to somebody just yesterday. His name is Craig Shanahay, and he is the president of operations at a big engineering company called Wood PLC. And he's a chemical engineer, but he didn't go into chemical engineer through the usual route. He actually did an apprenticeship. And he learned to weld, and he learned to operate a plant. And after a while, he got his degree, and he got a first-class chemical engineering degree, and is doing very well in his career. So there are multiple ways of becoming an engineer. If you're not everyone is necessarily the sort of academic type. If but you've got the option of doing an engineering apprenticeship. And in England, is actually, there are many benefits to doing an apprenticeship. So even if you are academic, and over time, when I've worked with engineers, I usually know the ones who have also done an apprenticeship, because they're just a lot more hands-on, and they've got a way of dealing with things that I actually admire, because I think I look at them as, really good engineers too. So.
Brilliant. And we've got two final questions. So
Okay.
The first one is around when you don't get things quite right. So when something's not going right and it's not doing what you want it to do, how do you keep going, and what steps do you take to keep motivating yourself?
That's a really good question. A really, really good question. Very mature question. So one of the things that I do is, and I've certainly come to those points at times when you feel like you've tried everything that you can. Sometimes what I try to do is just take a step back and reflect. And sometimes I might even just walk away from my desk in the office and just sit in the lounge and just think. And that enables you to actually just walk through what has happened, and it may help you to identify the problem. Sometimes you struggle to solve a problem, not because you don't have the solution, but it might be factors that have nothing to do with the work that you're doing. You might have had a really long day the day before. You might be really tired, and if you're really tired, you're not in any position to solve the problem. Sometimes it's a good idea to just leave it for a while, go for a walk, and then come back a bit refreshed. But what I've tried to do is understand where the problem is. And sometimes the problem is that you've got missing information. And then it's been able to give the problem a name, actually identify what is the actual problem here. I then, why have I got that problem? Is it because of something I don't yet know? And if it's because of something I don't yet know, then I know, okay, who do I need to ask for that information from? Or what sources or references do I need to go to give me that information? And then once I've got the information, I'm ready to go. So sometimes it's a matter of just continuing to work until you find the question. But the important thing to always be able to ask is what is the problem? Give the problem a name. What is the issue here? The issue isn't necessarily that this system isn't working. The issue is that I'm missing some bit of information that will help it work. One other thing that I've also learned is that as an engineer, one of the most important skills that you need to have is people skills, to be able to work with people, to be able to communicate with people, because you will get very far in life if you can get along with people. If you insist all the time that it has to be done my way, and I'm not going to listen, and I'm not going to listen, or even if I'm wrong, I'm not going to admit that I'm wrong. I'm just going to keep pushing my point. Then that doesn't really work. So one of the qualities of a good engineer is the ability to listen to others, and the ability to just listen enough to understand, not just to kind of give your own response. And then it's also the ability to just work with other people. And that can be very, very important.
Brilliant. I always find that sometimes if it's not making sense, take some time away and just think about it away from the immediate area.
Absolutely.
So the final question then that we've got, and I think this is a brilliant question to end the interview and to end this season of interviews as well. What's the main advice that you would give to the young people who we've got watching today, or who might be watching this again on YouTube in the future? What is the main advice you would give them if they want to pursue engineering as a potential career?
So the first thing I would say is the question that I asked you at the very start. If I was to give you, if you had the power to change things, if I gave you £1 million, for example, to solve a problem, what would that problem be? What are the things that you're interested in? What are the problems that really catch you? So I gave an example. In my second year, I was reading of one of my courses, and I saw this aspect to do with nitrogen oxides, and I was really fascinated in that. So find that thing that really kind of catches your interest, or that problem that you really want to solve, or just those ideas that you have. And once you've got those ideas, find people who are in that world who you can learn from. Attend events like this, speak to people who are engineers who work in the sector and who can tell you about their experiences. And then you've got to, then once you've decided that this is what you want to do, you've got to then think about what is the roadmap that's going to get me there. So for a lot of people, it's what courses do I need to study? Are there some that I find naturally interesting? There might be others that you might struggle with one small aspect of it. The important thing is to be honest with yourself and say, well, I'm struggling in this particular area. Can I get some help? You'll get very far in life if you know when to ask for help. And once you've got that support you've then got the opportunity to learn. And when you become an engineer, never get to a point where you think, oh, I know everything now. Always challenge yourself to learn more. And that's why I say I'm learning every single day. And then the final thing I will say is that everyone you meet in life has something they can teach you. And so when I was doing my PhD, for example, I found that the best conversations I was having were not conversations with people who are actually engineers. They're just everyday people that I met who asked me, once I told them about a problem, says, oh, what about this? I heard this in the news. And that gives you so much information that helps you. So everyone you meet has something they can teach you and something you can learn from. And if you follow that principle, I think you will all go far. You're going to go far anyway, because you're here.
If I unmute, we can carry on. Thank you so much for that, Ollie. No, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for your time today. Thank you so much to the schools who've joined us. And thank you to everyone who's joined us for this series of interviews. We hope that we have inspired you a little bit to answer that question of, if you were an engineer, what would you do? The deadline for your entries to come into us is next Wednesday. We've already got thousands here with us, and it has been fantastic seeing the ideas and the inventions that you have all come up with. And over the coming months, we will get them all graded by engineers, and they will all be judged ahead of us announcing the winners at events right across the UK this summer. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for everybody who's taken the time to be part of this season of interviews. Thank you so much, Ollie, for giving up your time this afternoon to close out the season and to finish off British Science Week. And we will be back soon, I'm sure, with more engineers to inspire you. But for now, from myself and from the rest of the team here at Primary Engineer, and from Ollie Folayan, who's joined us this afternoon, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you for the opportunity.